Hi and welcome to the second lecture on using interviews as a source of data collection. As we said, if you want to collect your primary data yourself, so you have a number of means used in social research in general and political science research in particular. So we started last time speaking about interviews, and we said, well, we're speaking about both elite interviewing or interviewing elites, political or intellectual elites, or even interviewing ordinary people. Although most of our analysis focused on elite interviews. Today we're going to continue on the techniques and the tactics, if you will, that are used in interviews. How we can manage the interview to get the best results, but also how to use the material that you get from interviews in writing research. Most of you may not be using actually interviews in your proposed research. So, taking a quick look at the different topics you're working on, I think most of you, or some of you at least, will be using surveys. Most of you will be depending on secondary sources. But this does not mean that it's not important to know the major means that you should know as a political science student and as a political science researcher if you want to collect data that is new and that makes a difference in our understanding of whatever phenomena we're speaking about. So even if you're not using this tool and all these details that we have been speaking about since last time, even if you're not using it in your research this semester, you may be interested to use it in your graduation project or in your future research as a political science researcher, right? So last time we spoke about why is it important to use interviews and what value added can interviews offer in political science research. And we also spoke about how to select the samples of interviewees and how to justify this selection. And we ended up with speaking about designing the questions, right? How to put a limited number of questions in a semi-structured interview, and how to write even a general interview protocol that presents the idea of your research and propose the major questions that will be discussed with your interviewee. Today we have 2 points, basically to know how to manage the interview to get the best results, and then how to use the results of this interview or the material of the interview in writing your research. And I hope you had time to read the first lecture and listen to it, and also to have a quick look at an example of studies that use interviews. I suggested my own study on Nile hydropolitics, but you can also read any other source you may find useful on using interviews in political science research. So here we start speaking about how to efficiently manage interviews, especially with elites. And we'll be speaking about practicalities and advices, down-to-earth advices given by political science scholars who conducted interviews with elites or with ordinary people before, and who gave us these tips and tricks of how to manage interviews more efficiently. So there is nothing like secret or ideal manual that we can all use. I mean, it depends, of course, and it differs, as we said before, from one topic to the other. If the topic is sensitive, so the advices may differ. Conducting interviews in an open context that is open to research circles is very different from a context where there is no such communication between officials, for instance, and researchers. So it depends. But what we're offering here are general advices that most of the time worked with researchers who conducted interviews before. And at the end of this presentation, you'll find a recommended source, which is a few pages written by one of these scholars who conducted interviews before and who offered his advices on managing interviews. Of course, in the interviews and in managing interviews, we have different stages that start with planning for the interviews and for each interview. So in planning for the interviews, as we said, we spoke before about deciding on our samples. We're not going to repeat that. But what is important here is that while you identify or after identifying your interviewees, you have to also plan how can you reach them. So I think part of the problem that you find it, you may find my analysis or my presentation here too remote or very difficult. How can I meet a head of a political party or a deputy minister or what have you? Of course, you will not do that yourself. I mean, if you're a young researcher, and I've been using that myself, as I told you, in the last 10-15 years or so, it's the fact that as we mentioned before, you're building your networks, but you're doing that through others. So if you want to meet a senior official, you will most probably ask your professors or your friends who may be, for instance, working in this political party or in this civil society organization, or working as a researcher in the Egyptian parliament, for instance, to help you to get access to these potential interviewees. So that's how this is done simply, right? And you often, as we'll see later, use the two tracks, the formal and informal tracks, even in the what we call open circles, in which officials are very cooperative with the researchers. You need to use the two tracks, right? You need to have this kind of informal channels through which you can easily access these senior people. If you're wondering what is then the case with interviews with ordinary people, you need here also some sort of a mediator, someone from the community itself. So if you want to study poverty in a certain in a slum area, for instance, right, in a marginalized area in Cairo, whatever this area is, you will just not go and start speaking with people. Of course, you will need permission from state institutions, and this is the procedural point, but you will also need someone from the community itself to introduce you to the community, right? So again, I mean, it's basically trying to reach out first to some sort of a mediator or person who will actually facilitate your access to this community or to this official or to this institution or what have you. Yeah? And we mentioned before when we spoke about samples how at the end of each interview, and this applies to both interviews with ordinary people and interviews with officials, that you should remember to ask at the end of each interview, to ask the interviewee if he recommends another person. And we said that this leads you to end with what we call a snowball sample, which means that you will have a larger and larger sample, even if it is not, the results cannot be generalized, but you're actually getting more and more useful insights from additional people, right? Sometimes when this interview is kind enough, or show, and this of course depends on your own assessment, show a degree of cooperation, openness during the interview, you can also ask him even to try to put you in contact with the person that he recommends or she recommends, right? So you're not only asking him, who else do you recommend that I speak with, but you also ask him, how can I actually speak to him, or if you can just give him an idea. And I found that this was done even without me asking. So some, for instance, in my own interviews with Sudanese or Ethiopian officials or Egyptian officials in the last few years, they will even offer that they speak to other persons in order to give them an idea about what I'm doing and suggest that they meet me, and this helped a lot. And as you have seen before in the interview protocol that we proposed last lecture, we contact the interviewee in the most possible formal way. So I have an official letter from my institution with a letterhead signed by the head of my institution, the head of my department, or the vice dean, or whoever is responsible for writing these letters, addressing the targeted interviewee in an official way, right, and presenting the idea of my research. And of course, as we said also last time, when I write my contacts, I make sure to write an official email address, an institutional email address, not kukumiki at gmail.com or at yahoo.com, right? So all these things actually make a difference in how the interview take you or not take you seriously. And then there is also a very practical decision, and as you can see, we are speaking here about very important practicalities, right? Things that allow you to to do and to manage and to master the interview itself. So you need also to take a decision on whether you're gonna record the interviews or not. Of course, if you record the interview, this will be very good because you can then easily get all the details, transcribe the interview, take quotes and use quotes from the interview. But this will, of course, make the interviewee a bit conservative, because that's a normal inclination, right? All of us, if we feel that we are recorded, as the case now with me, we will feel a bit conservative. Yeah. So you may take the decision that even if the interviewee said yes, it's fine that you record the interview, you tape record the interview, I may make the decision that, well, this person is, for instance, too senior, that even if he agreed, well, it's better not to tape record him, because all these people are also quite sensitive to using this material against them before. So in order for him to be more open, maybe it's better not to tape record. And of course, if you decided that, so you have to make time after the interview to sit down and make take as much notes as possible from your own memory. So yes, you will take notes during the interview, and that's why skills that I asked Rami in the section to work on them with you, like note taking and other skills are very important in writing research. So taking notes efficiently, and even if you found that, well, a statement is actually an interesting statement, you should be able to write it as exactly as it was said, is important in such situations. And then of course you will not be able to write everything, so you better make time after the interview to sit down and write from your memory as much as you can on this interview. So you are supposed to prepare well for the interviews in general, but even before each interview, you should prepare well, right? Especially if you're meeting, senior officials. Because as we said, you want to raise questions, the answer to which are not found elsewhere, right? And thus you should never ask a senior official, the senior official about, for instance, his background, or you're for instance, meeting the deputy foreign minister for African affairs, or for Asian affairs, or for Arab affairs, right? And to ask him about a topic of interest, you should not actually go and ask him where he served before, right? Because these are kind of information that you can find just by googling his name, as we said before, right? So try to read about the interviewee. Of course, if he's a less senior official, you will not find information about him, so maybe it's fine to ask him how long have you been responsible for this file or what have you. So this will be fine. But if you're speaking about a more senior official, you'll most probably find information about him. So reading about the official, and I found that interesting myself, saying to the official, well, you said this in your interview with this newspaper, or you served in this capital before, so how was your experience? I mean, giving a signal to the interviewee that you know about him, that you know his background, his ideas, and so on, will actually make a very good rapport, make a very good relationship between you and the interviewee, and allow him to think seriously about the questions you're raising, and not just dumb down his or her answers, not just giving you information and views on the top of his mind without thinking. So yes, obviously you need the interview to take you seriously, and one way of the one hand increasing your confidence in yourself and your performance during the interview, but also getting what you want is to prepare well by reading about the person that you're going to meet. Right, so assuming that I prepared well for the interviews in general, and then I'm preparing well before each interview, the second step is thus to manage the interview itself. What should I do during the interview itself? As we said, I mean, you should not assume that the person will, especially in very attractive issues like nowadays, the issue that I'm working with, Nile conflict and cooperation and so on. There are tens and maybe hundreds of scholars in different parts of the world who are working on this issue, and thus officials get, tens and hundreds of interview requests. So do not just assume that the person you're meeting will actually remember the official letter that was sent to him by you requesting this interview. So you should start by presenting yourself again, giving a hint on your research. Do not say that, well, I already sent that by email or sent that by post. No, I mean, you should start also for ice breaking and for orienting the interviewee to what you really need. You should start with this information. Then also inform the interviewee that if he wants to be anonymous, i.e. if he wishes or she wishes that his or her name will not be mentioned, that this will be secured. Any information will be used only for research purpose. If there is, things that, should remain totally off the record, this will also be ensured, and we will come to that when we speak about the ethics of conducting interviews at the end of this presentation, right? So I should remind him of all that. Again, I will not assume that, well, I wrote that already in my letter requesting the interview. I have to start, in the first couple of minutes with all these assurances and background information. As we mentioned before, I mean, the conducting interviews is kind of both a skill that you acquire with time, an art, right, and less so a science, right? As we said at the very beginning of this presentation, it's not like we have, science or rigid rules that should be applied in every case. It's actually a skill that it's more of a skill that you acquire and adjust to each topic, right? And the skill that you acquire with practicing the conduct of interviews is how to actually stay alert during the interview and react to the responses of the interview. I can understand that, well, if you're doing the first interview in your life, you will be tempted just to hear what the interviewer is saying and try to take notes of what he's saying, especially if you're not recording the interview and so on. But with time you will acquire this talent of doing all these things at the same time, right? Listening, processing and understanding what the interviewee is saying, responding to him and raising questions and follow-up questions and so on, and taking notes at the same time. And of course, staying alert is important, because we're speaking about here, we said that the most common type of interviews conducting in political science and in social sciences in general is the semi-structured interviews, which means, as we said, that there will be space for follow-up questions. And this means that you should actually not just read the questions and record or take note of the responses, but you should also raise questions during the interview that were not prepared beforehand, right? And try to make sure that the interviewee does not go too far off the subject or off the topic, right? Because I mean, it's again, it's a skill that you have to acquire by time, right? And you may be in a situation where you have, which is evident in most of the cases, you have only 30 minutes or maybe less than that to meet this very important interviewee who was involved in these negotiations or in taking this decision or what have you. And you want to ask him very important question, but then he, in order to avoid, answering your question, he takes you to a totally another area and try to speak about something else, right? And there are two things here. I mean, sometimes that what he's saying is still very important and relevant, so you can, give him a space to continue what he's saying. But you can also try to politely stop him and remind him that, well, you are interested in this or that point, if what he is saying is totally irrelevant to your topic, or to your interests, or to your questions. So again, this is something that you have to assess yourself during the interview. Sometimes it's useful, or often actually it's useful, to try to summarize the interviewee's answer to make sure that you understood correctly and allow him to make any clarifications or to correct any misunderstanding. I.e., so after he answers your question in, 5-10 minutes, so you simply say in a couple of sentences, so what you're suggesting or what you're saying is X or Y. So he may answer by saying, yes, this is the case, and blah 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 blah, so he continues to clarify. Or he may say, no, this is not exactly what I meant. So this is an opportunity for you to correct any misunderstandings. And then what makes also the discussion interesting is for you to cite other sources. So as I said before, you can say to the interviewee, well, you said in your interview with this newspaper or in this TV show, for instance, that blah 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 blah. So can you clarify more this point, or why you said that, for instance, right? Or you said in your autobiography that this happened in this round of negotiations. Can you clarify that? Okay. So this again shows the interview that you have knowledge, that you've been kind of following him and what he's saying, and also to cross-check sources, right? Because as we said, it's very important to diversify your sources, to cross-check sources, meaning that, well, to evaluate which source is more accurate than the other. You can make this reference to other sources during the interview. Then how to end the interview? As we said, the first important thing that you should remember is to, after thanking the interviewee, of course, is to ask if he can recommend any other person. But before doing that, you should ask him if there is any other thing that he wants to comment on. And this is very important because, again, you are interested in some specific questions based on your own research, and sometimes you may be missing something, or he or she may have something to say outside the focus or outside the area of the question that you raise. So it's important to give the interviewee space at the end to comment or to add any other insights that he thinks is useful. Yeah. Um, Also, I found it very useful, and many of those conducting interviews found it useful that one stays after the end of the interview. Of course, if the interviewee has time. Sometimes as I've seen myself, sometimes the interview is very busy that he has to cut the interview short or whatever. But sometimes if you're lucky and the person has time to after ending the interview to chat on other issues, I think this is often useful. Yeah. So he may actually after you, especially if you're recording the interview, after ending or after putting the record off, and after formally ending the interview may start actually to say interesting stuff, interesting things. And of course, one has to be careful how to use this information, which are off the record, and we'll come to this later. But in any way, in any case, information revealed here are often interesting. Of course, as we said before, if you are not tape recording the interview, you should make time to sit down somewhere and try to write down as much notes as you remember. So then the most crucial stage is what to do with all this interview material. So you have went through all these challenges of highlighting or determining who do you want to meet, and trying through your professors or other people or people in the community, if you're meeting with ordinary people, to access those targeted interviewees. And then you talk to them for hours and hours, depending of course on the size of your sample. And then you end up with tens or hundreds of pages of views and insights by different officials or scholars if in elite interviews, or ordinary people if you're doing an ethnographic study with ordinary people. So what to do with all this material? First of all, the first thing that should be clear in your writing, whatever you're writing, a thesis of 100-page, or if that's a master thesis, or a PhD of 300-400 pages, or just a journal article or a research paper or an assignment of 10-20 pages. The first thing that has to be clear is all the methodological details of the interviews. And here we can have a look quickly at my own research to see what I mean. So here I started by saying why I did the interviews. So for me, the main argument of my paper was that yes, there may be some benefits from cooperation between countries, but these benefits are not objective, right? They depend on how officials define these benefits, whether they actually see it or not, and what are the challenges, on the other hand, that they see from this cooperation, right? So I started by saying why it was important for me to hold these interviews, and then I said, when were the interviews conducted and where? So between September and November 2017, I conducted this type of interview, this number of interviews in these cities, right? So I have to write when, where, the type of interviews conducted, how many interviews were conducted. All these details should be included. Yeah? And then, of course, if I'm writing a thesis, I will have, the space to write the list of interviewees. Of course, if the person required that he should remain anonymous or his name should not be mentioned, so I should just write, the senior official, for instance, and just write the date and the place in which I met him, right? But if you're writing a short assignment or a research paper or journal article, as in this case, one has just to mention the person that he met in general, right? Meeting senior officials in this or that ministry. If you're meeting scholars or researchers, you also mention that. So you give an idea whom exactly you met, right? And then what I found useful in my research is also to mention how I got access to these people, because the reader may wonder how I was able to get access to senior Egyptian, Sudanese and Ethiopian officials, right? So I had to mention, if you can see in page 6, that I was meeting these people already in different conferences and workshops and so on, and that I was hosted by research institutes that are very close to policy circles, and that facilitated my access to these officials, right? So this was also useful in increasing the credibility of my results, right? And I also mentioned that, well, in the case of Egypt, for instance, Egyptian officials interviewed on conditions of anonymity, so they required that the positions and the names not to be mentioned, and to standardize that I did not mention any names in my research, but I just referred to them according to their positions. So I will say senior diplomat without even referring to his exact position, again to ensure anonymity, right? And then say what were not list the questions. So sometimes you can list the questions. If you have 6, 7, 8 questions, you can simply list them, write them, or you can say, well, the questions covered so and so, right? The major lines of the questions, right? So try to be as clear and as detailed as possible in saying how did you actually reach these results. Right? Because obviously if you met 5 people is different from if you actually met 60 or 70 people. Yeah, the size of the sample will make a difference. If you selected a random sample, it's very different from if you selected a non-random sample, right? So you have to be clear about all these methodological details and even challenges. So if you did not manage to meet someone who is very important, so you can say so that I tried a couple of times to reach X and Y, but this was not possible, and I met, for instance, his deputy or whatever. Right? So you have to be as clear as possible, and then also how even you analyze the results. As we will see in a minute, there are different ways in analyzing the material, right? The content of the interview, the information that you get, or the insights that you get. So you have also to make this clear, whether you recorded the interview or not, right? All these information should be actually made clear. Then coming to the material itself, you have 2 ways that you can combine or use either, right? So we may analyze this content quantitatively or qualitatively, and of course to analyze it you should better have the exact content, right? Which means that you should record these interviews. But if you even have just your notes, you can do this analysis also quantitatively and qualitatively, but it will not be as accurate as getting the exact answers of the interview. So we will be speaking about content analysis later, right? And you can simply analyze this material using content analysis quantitatively and qualitatively. Quantitatively by assessing the frequency of certain words. Right? So if you found, for instance, one of the basic issues of disagreement between Egypt and Ethiopia on the Nile issue is historical agreements. So if you found that, well, Ethiopian officials are repeating the word historical agreements, Nile historical agreements, so it would be interesting to say, well, that this was repeated, I don't know, 90 times or 100 times or what have you, right? So sometimes the frequency is in itself interesting, how many times this word was repeated, the word cooperation or the word conflict or the word what have you. So this in itself is indicative, but you also need to do a qualitative analysis, and qualitatively you simply go into the material and try to analyze them by classifying them or dividing them into themes, for instance. So I ask people about, for instance, what are the opportunities and the sectors of cooperation. So the opportunities, we can start to divide them into 1, 2, 3 based on the content that I have. The sectors, what sectors did they identify? So 1, 2, 3, again, try to simply divide or classify them, and then say, for instance, most of the Sudanese officials or the Egyptian officials or the Ethiopian officials saw more opportunities than challenges, or attributed the failure of this project to whatever variables, and so on and so forth. So I start to analyze the content that I have by dividing them into different themes, and then also it's useful to say the trend, the major trend, that most of these officials were in favor of this, or were against this, or whatever. Yeah? And there are two ways to do it. You can do it manually, both qualitative and quantitative, or now we have some new software programs like Atlas.ti. And what Atlas.ti is useful for is especially in quantitative analysis, right? Because it will be very boring to try to count yourself how many times a certain word was repeated, but this will be done with a click on a certain function in Atlas.ti. But still, if you're using Atlas.ti, what you do is simply, and you can just spend a few minutes on the website, and many also free tutorials on using this software, but simply you upload the material that you have to the program, and then you yourself also have to divide these materials into ideas, what's called codes in these software programs. We call them codes, which are basically the major ideas or themes of the material or of the interview material, right? So you have to do it yourself. So there are things that can be done very easily in the program, like counting words, for instance. You should not count them manually yourself. But other things that you have to do yourself, like defining the main ideas. He may, depending on this frequency, for instance, suggest some ideas that, well, based on the material that you provided, the basic concept that were actually repeated is so and so. But there is still a very important role for the researcher, even in this new technological advances associated with this new software programs. What you should also do while analyzing the material that you have is try to compare the answers of each interviewee and of different interviewees. So again, if a person said something and then he contradicted himself, so you can flag that or underscore that or highlight that in your analysis. Or if different interviewees, although all are officials in the same institution, for instance, offer different explanations, so this will also be interesting to highlight. So again, if you read my paper, you will find, for instance, that I'm referring to the fact that, well, some Ethiopian officials said that some initiatives and cooperation initiatives proposed by Egypt were not implemented because of bureaucratic hurdles or obstacles, right? Because it's just bureaucracy, and bureaucracy takes lots of time and so on and so forth, and that's why the development fund or the infrastructure development fund, for instance, was not implemented. But others were more open to speak about, as we said, the role of historical agreements and how they think that these historical agreements on the Nile are actually hindering cooperation in other spheres, right, or in other sectors, in other economic sectors. So here you can get interesting insights from comparing what different people are saying. Yeah. And you can also highlight the intensity of attitudes, how strong, not only how they view or how think, but also how strong they hold this or that position. So again, in my case, for instance, I made the point that, well, Sudanese officials are, most of them at least, are very much strongly in favor of the Renaissance Dam, which again you can see from your from following the news. And what was interesting also is to note that some of them are still, until now, decades after the launching of the Aswan High Dam, some of them are still very much against the impact, or they're very much blaming Egypt for not taking into consideration the sacrifices offered by Sudan in building the Aswan High Dam, and how Sudan's cultural heritage of the Nubians in northern Sudan was actually lost as a result of building this project, and how Sudan is not actually benefiting from the electricity produced by the Aswan Dam, and so on and so forth. So again, you can see things like that are not available elsewhere, and you can highlight not only this attitude and views, but also how strong are they, the intensity of these views and attitudes and so on. While analyzing the material of the interview, it's also interesting to stop at the unexpected responses. Remember, at the very beginning of discussing interviews, we said that one of the major advantages of interviews is getting sometimes unexpected responses from some officials, or even ordinary people. And again, I mean, you should here be not very skilled, but you should be simply open to things that are not traditional and indirect responses to your questions. The interesting example that I always make in even training sessions that I give on interviews, and even in my presentations to my own work on this topic, is when I ask a senior party official in Ethiopia about his views on the opportunities and benefits of cooperation with Egypt, and he answered me with something that actually struck me. He asked me, but is Egypt an African country in the first place? Right? So of course he's not giving me a direct answer to my question, but his answer is very indicative. He is raising the point that, well, one of the means through which Ethiopia is trying to, raise doubts about, Egypt's connection with the African continent in general is through raising doubt about Egypt's identity, and how Egypt, only as some Ethiopians try to claim, is only connected to the African continent through the Nile, and is not seeing any other benefit from connecting with the continent, and that is prioritizing the Nile water issue, but is not really culturally and politically connected to the continent, right? So I think this was an indicative answer, was an unexpected response, because yes, you may hear that in your discussion with young scholars or researchers and so on, but to have this view so clearly aired and revealed by a senior party official was actually quite interesting for me. Finally, and you can see that also in my paper, Of course, one of the basic advantages of speaking to the senior people is that you can use quotes. Their quotes are important, but you have to make sure that the paper is not just, a list of quotes one after the other, because this will be very boring, right? Your own mission is to try to analyze all this material and use the most relevant of them just to back your analysis, right? So you will analyze all what has been said, but if you found that a certain statement is as we said, is striking, for instance, or is very indicative, or captured, the whole idea or view of a senior official on this or that topic, so you can here quote him or her, right? But try not to, make your paper a long list of quotes, one after the other. The last point I want to make in conducting interviews is the ethical rules of conducting interviews. And of course, there are many ethical rules, and in some institutions, one has to even sign, papers that conform with the rules of the university. I mean, in our university, we do not have such rules for conducting research or conducting interviews that we have to sign. Sometimes in some universities, for instance, so when I receive requests from some young scholars for an interview, sometimes they ask me also to sign a form that I agree to using, the material that they gain from me in their own research. So it's sometimes the responsibility of the universities to set these rules. But in general, we can refer to two major rules. Of course, there are many others, but these are, I wouldn't say the most two important, but practically speaking, these are two important major rules. The first is to be committed as a researcher not to disclose the identity of the interviewees, either elite or ordinary people. So as I said, for instance, in my case, some officials said, well, we are happy to speak to you, but you should not mention our names or our exact title. So of course I have to be committed to that. I cannot just, take whatever information and views, and then after committing myself to not to disclose their identity, I mention their name. I think this will be not only unethical, but it will also affect the whole research enterprise, because this person will not do any interviews with any other researcher. So I'm not harming myself only and my reputation as a researcher and my credibility as a researcher, but I'm also harming the research enterprise and the research community in general. Yeah, and the same for ordinary people, and that's why again. I mean, many universities have clear information on that. Research projects that include humans or what have you. This is not only relevant for those who are doing, natural sciences, biology, or what have you. There are also rules for those in social sciences who are dealing with people, right? That you should not, again, if you're, for instance, meeting someone from a civil society organization, human rights organization, for instance, who will reveal very sensitive information about his relationship with the state or with some institutions in the state. So you should not reveal or disclose his identity because this may actually put him at risk. So you should not subject your interviews to any danger or to any risk. If he's an official, you should not again disclose his name. If he required to remain anonymous, if he's an ordinary people that can be later on targeted by the state or by state institutions in closed context, you should not mention his name at all. Sometimes, and this is even in it's a kind of a journalistic rule, People use other nicknames, right? So they will not mention the name of the person himself. They will mention any other name, for instance. And if they're telling a life story of a specific community, for instance, they will mention another name, which is not the true name of the person. And this is another way of just, hiding his identity or her identity. Also, as we mentioned before, in our interview, there will be different types of information revealed. There will be on the record information that the person can say clearly, and he can be happy to be attributed to him. So I can say this person, and I say his name and his position, said that. So they will have no problem mentioning their name and the information. But there will be what's called off-the-record information, and this information he will highlight. So he may come to a certain moment in the interview where he say, well, I will tell you something, but this should remain off the record. And by saying that, well, this is off the record, means that it should not be mentioned at all. You may wonder then why he told you that. Well, as I said, some interviewees may be too open to speak frankly, but at the same time, will tell you something just for your own information. And if he said that this is off the record, so this should not be mentioned at all, right? And third type of information is that not for attribution. Not for attribution means that the information itself can be revealed, but you should not attribute it to the person who said it. So you mention the fact, but you do not mention who said this fact, right, or this information. So again, you should be very much aware of this distinction, because you should not confuse the three types of information or material, and you should be committed to what the interviewee tells you about this type of information, whether you can attribute it to him and mention the information on the record, whether you should not mention it at all, or whether you can mention it but without associating it to him or her, right? I hope by now you get a good background about using interviews in political science research. As I said, you may not be using it now, but if you want to collect data yourself, and it's actually lots of fun. As someone who practiced that for years, I can tell you that it's very different. I mean, writing research through just going to the library and reading, a few books and articles, and then bringing a word from here and a sentence from there, and writing research is not a big thing, right? Anyone can do that. But going to the field, right, and observing, next time we'll be speaking about observation, for instance, and observing the behavior of people, or of members of certain civil society or political party, what have you, and noting down your notes, or holding interviews with officials or with ordinary people. All these direct ways of contact with your subjects in the field makes a big difference in the results you get, and make a notable contribution to our knowledge about the topic that we're discussing, and obviously makes other people interested in reading what you're writing, right? Because they will not be interested in writing your assemblage of other sources that they already read, but they will be interested in your research if you're presenting something new. And you can only present something new if you're collecting new data yourself. So I hope this gave you some, as we said, tips and tricks on how you can use one of these sources of data collection. If you have any questions, we can leave the next lecture to answering your questions on interviews, right? So if in a couple of days I received a number of questions that are worth collecting them together and answering them in a separate lecture, so we can do that before moving to observation. If not, I will assume that you're fine with what we have been discussing in these two lectures on interviews, and I will then move to the second method of data collection from the field, which is observation. And I will also provide, as always, a recommended reading on research that used observation. Depending on my interest, this is also on water issues, but again, that's because what I know about. But if you're interested in any other topic, you can try to search and propose any other article or book or any other academic source that use observation to collect data. Thank you, and yeah, stay safe.